So that's how you end up with adults that just wait for talking heads to tell them what to believe, what to think. Echo chambers, they wait to be in the echo chamber to just tell them how to feel, how to think. That's how you'll end up with folks who flip-flop on every single issue because they don't actually think about them. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the video. You can support uncensored conversations via Cash App or buying your girl a coffee. This is Jared Henderson, and this is the American Literacy Crisis Explained.
Everywhere you look, you will see the headlines. Kids these days don't know how to read. Literacy is on the decline, kids don't read for pleasure anymore, and some want to say that we are living through a literacy crisis. You'll even see some claim that 40% of American kids can't read. That's not true, by the way, and we're going to talk about that later in this video. Are we living through a literacy crisis, or is this just a long-standing failure dressed up as something new? If you want to understand the American literacy crisis, you need to know three numbers. First up, 40%. That's the percentage of American fourth graders who cannot read at what's called a basic level. Every few years, students around the country take a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP. This is also sometimes called the nation's report card, and it allows us to track educational progress throughout the country. Reading scores have remained relatively stable since 1992 until 2019, when they started to decline. Sometimes that's reported as saying that 40% of students can't read, but that's not what those statistics mean. So now 40% of fourth graders can't read at what's considered a basic level, and only 31% can read at what's considered a proficient level. The NAEP also defines those terms, and just because a kid can't read at basic level doesn't mean that they can't read. But the literacy crisis doesn't stop at elementary schools.
Technically, if you have a fifth grader that reads at a first grade or second grade level, they technically can read, but they can't read at the level that they're supposed to be reading at. So yes, when we say people are illiterate, that's why I like to use the term functioning illiterate, because it's not that people can't read at all, it's that their reading level is far lower than it should be. And that's still a huge problem.
In the last decade, that number has increased by 9 points. This doesn't mean that those adults can't read, but it does mean that they are what's called functionally illiterate. This means that they lack literacy skills which would allow them to navigate the world and go about their day-to-day task. And our final number is 21. That's Mississippi's ranking in fourth grade literacy as of 2022. In 2013, Mississippi was ranked 49th. They were basically at the bottom of the country's rankings, and now they are well above the middle. And that's because they saw the problem and they actually tried to solve it. So at the end of this video, we're going to talk about what Mississippi has done right. But first, we're going to take a slightly closer look at that NAEP data. Literacy scores have been declining since 2019. This might not be that surprising because something rather big happened in 2020, which caused a lot of school closures, and we've generally seen learning loss across the board. Absenteeism is also up post-COVID, which does complicate actually teaching.
And I don't know if he's going to get into this because he might be a left-leaner, he might be right-leaner, I don't know. And people's biases will play into how they give information. But it's not just that kids weren't in school. It's also when they were in school, what the hell were they learning? They sure as hell weren't learning how to read and write. They sure as hell weren't learning their arithmetics. No, they were learning about all the different genders. They were learning about sexuality. That's what they were learning. They weren't learning anything of substance, anything of value. So on top of kids not being in school, when they are in school, they're learning a bunch of bullshit. That's going to increase the illiteracy. All of this plays into it, but also when they are in school, they're not actually practicing the skills that they need to succeed. I didn't mean for that to rhyme. And I'm telling you this from experience. I have worked as a tutor. It's shocking. I had one student and he was in fifth grade. He's probably in sixth grade now. And he was reading at like a second, maybe third grade level. I would ask basic questions about a story that we just read together. This is what I'm saying about functioning illiterate. He's able to read most of the words. But then when I ask comprehension questions about it, very obvious questions, crickets. And the saddest part about it was didn't have any internal motivation to try to fix it. He was coming to class just like, I just want to get this over with. Didn't even understand why it's so important that he fixes his ability to read. It was just absolutely unfortunate. Working with kids in this day and age, especially if you're a teacher that values actual education, phonics, and then you work with kids that are struggling in that department and you're trying to play catch up with them, it's very depressing. There are some high moments when you get that child to start improving, which I have seen that, where I've seen improvement with the students that I've worked with, but it's still depressing nonetheless.
One group of student hasn't seen a decline in their test scores though. These are students who are already in the 90th percentile. So what we're seeing is a widening gap between those students who are reading quite well and those students who are struggling to read at a basic level. This tells us something important. If we want to improve American literacy, the biggest impact we can have is by focusing on those students who are struggling to read the most. And that's going to be important when we talk about Mississippi in a few minutes. But even those top performing students, like the students who would go on to study at really great colleges and universities, are also struggling. At the University of Texas here in Austin, some professors told their school newspaper that they would be shortening reading assignments and transitioning to assigning things like YouTube videos and audiobooks instead of physical books.
Isn't that what I was just telling you guys earlier? College students cannot read books cover to cover, which is crazy to me. We were doing that in middle school. Hell, elementary school, we were reading books cover to cover. I was reading Harry Potter, those long ass books in elementary school. And you know what? What's crazy is that it used to be a flex to read. It used to be an entire flex to read. I felt so badass walking into the classroom with my thick ass Harry Potter book saying that I'm reading The Goblet of Fire and it's this big and I'm actually reading through it and getting through it. It was a flex. I don't know why we stopped that. Well, I know why. It's for control and all this. We talked about that. But it used to be a flex to be reading big ass books as a young child. That used to be the flex. I remember when I was in like second grade or something like that, or maybe it was third grade, people were flexing on the fact that they were reading wholes because it was a 50 chapter, but even though it's kind of, the chapters are shorter, but people were flexing on, oh, I'm reading this book, it's got 50 chapters. Yeah, I'm reading this book, it's got this many pages. Folks were like, the kids I grew up with, unless they were already little bastards, we were flexing on the fact that we were reading big, long books with hard words in it and actually understanding what was happening in them. This was in elementary school. Even through high school, it was a flex to be able to read hard material and actually understand it and do well. It's truly sad. That's something that we're gonna prioritize in our household. My baby, she's gonna be reading the Junie B. Jones, okay? She's gonna be reading the R.L. Steins. We're taking it all the way back. We sure am. My baby's gonna read the Harry Potters. And we're gonna make it fun. It's gonna be a flex in our household to be smart. I'm gonna make sure that it is cool to be smart. You don't wanna be walking around being a dumbass, falling for every goddamn thing, being easily manipulated. That's stupid. You don't wanna be a stupid individual. We are gonna make being intelligent cool. Between me and Justin, yeah, our kids aren't gonna wanna be stupid because they know they'll get roasted. Obviously when they're older, they know they're gonna get roasted if they're being stupid, not ignorant. There's a difference between not knowing versus just willfully not knowing and not trying to educate yourself. We will be roasting stupidity in the house, not ignorance, but stupidity.
Because students simply didn't have the patience for the reading assignments anymore. One professor was told by his students that Shakespeare's Hamlet was too long to read. Now, Hamlet is the longest Shakespeare play, but it is about 30,000 words. It's much shorter than the vast majority of novels out there. These professors cited things like the rise of video content, but also phone usage, as leading to a decline in their students' reading abilities. But they've decided that they have to give in and change with the times so that they can meet their students where they are.
And that's not what you should do. No, I disagree with that entirely. You don't meet them where they are. You tell them to get their shit together to be where they should be. Instead of challenging them and forcing them to catch up. No, it's let's make this easier. Let's curve the grade. Let's go ahead and add a little curve to the grade so that the D's can become B's. Like, hell no. There are so many people that should still be in high school or should never have gotten their high school diploma because they did not meet those standards.
He used to teach 10 plays per semester. He's now teaching 6 in his classes. So even college students at good schools are struggling to read, and many of them are going to become adults who hardly read at all. Many Americans simply don't read books, and I think about 10% of college graduates haven't read a book in the last year. They don't know how to read, and maybe that's because they haven't been taught how to be a good reader. All right, let's pause for a second and ask ourselves what it means to be a good reader. And in this book, he points out that reading is actually a fairly demanding task. First, you have to be able to understand the words on the page, and that's usually what we mean when we say that we're teaching kids to read. But actually, reading involves 3 additional levels of representation. You need to be able to extract ideas from sentences, you need to be able to then connect the idea across those sentences, and then you integrate this within a model in your mind that answers the question of what the text is about. And
here's the other part about this that I don't know if he's going to touch on, is that the kids aren't even learning the phonetical structures of words. So what they're being taught is to memorize, okay, when you see these letters together, this says blue. They don't learn like different vowel teams. They don't learn the silent E. So time, T-I, the I is going to be long because you have the E at the end. They're not learning that. So when they go and they're reading through these sentences, they're only just memorizing the different words. So when they come across new words, rather than sounding it out, because how are you going to sound out a word when you don't know how these letters work together? Then when you come across words that you don't know, all you do is ask, well, how do you say, how do you pronounce? I don't know how many times I've had students when I was tutoring ask me, well, how do you say this? And I'm looking at them, well, I want you to try sounding it out. And it's not even that you have to get it 100%. I can tell the difference between someone who literally just has no idea what they're doing when it comes to sounding out a word, because some of the words in the English language, they don't follow the rules. But most words do follow those rules. And if I see the student applying those rules, even if it's to a word where the rule is kind of bent a little bit, if I see you applying those rules, then that's a good thing. That means you know your phonetical structures, you know your phonics. Yeah, we got a lot of leering centers. Exactly. We don't even have learning going on. We got a lot of leering. Okay, we got a bunch of leering, and that's the reason why the kids can't read, can't comprehend a damn thing.
And Willingham notes that many readers fail at the second level. They're not able to point out obvious contradictions in a paragraph that they read. If you're not reading at a level where you could even catch obvious contradictions, then you're going to struggle when you're reading sets of instructions or complicated forms.
Or when you have people, political talking heads, yapping at you and they're contradicting themselves left and right. See, if you can't read and understand those contradictories, you can't understand those contradictions in spoken language either. So this is why politicians are able to manipulate on both sides of the aisle. They're able to manipulate a lot of people because folks are not listening for those contradictions. It's just they hear one thought and they're like, yeah. And then they hear the next thought and they can only focus on those thoughts isolated. They can only focus on them isolated. They can't put 2 and 2 together to get 4, literally. And this is why the elitists want it this way, because you can easily manipulate people if they forget the first thing you said and they just latch on to each moment, forgetting the moments prior.
And really that contributes to what we called functional illiteracy before. That's that illiteracy that makes it difficult for you to navigate your day-to-day life. Being able to connect ideas is actually a skill that you have to develop. And I found that when I was teaching philosophy at some universities, that skill was something that my college students still needed to develop. I found that the worst question I could possibly ask when I started a discussion of some text in the classroom was, what is this text about? Because most students could tell you what some of the sentences said, but they weren't able to form a picture of the cohesive whole.
I noticed this too with some of the students that I worked with. I would ask them to put things into their own words, and rather than do that, they just go back and reread what's in the text. So that's a huge problem. You should be able to understand the sentences, understand what's being said in the story or the passage in a way where you can reword it using other words that you know and rephrase it into your own. So if they don't understand it, then they have to default to just rereading what's already in the text and not actually rewording it for themselves.
I had to guide them through interpreting a text. I would have to ask them questions like, what is the thesis of this article or this book or whatever it was that we were reading? Where are the arguments and the evidence for that thesis? And then is there any irrelevant or unnecessary information in the text? This was a process that I would guide my students through so that they could learn how to read better. But there was another barrier that my students faced, which is that they lacked a lot of background knowledge, which helped them make sense of a text. Let's say you want to read a really big book like War and Peace. Well, War and Peace is a historical novel. It is set in a particular time and place. You don't need to know all of the historical details in order to make sense of War and Peace, But having some idea of European history and maybe France's connection to Russia, knowing who people like Napoleon or Louis XVI are, these are things that would be useful for you as you're reading. It would make reading War and Peace a less demanding task. And I found that a lot of my students lacked historical knowledge or just general world knowledge, which would make reading books easier.
It's not enough that the kids can't understand what they're reading. It's also that they're not able to connect what they're reading to their own background knowledge. As far as like understanding context clues, you can't understand context clues if you can't decipher the damn clues. How are you going to decipher the damn clues if you have no background knowledge about life? That's why, having your kids plugged into different gaming systems and, just having them focused on all of that rather than taking them outside to see the real world, to have real life experiences, to even just having experiences in the house, baking and cooking and cleaning, and just, going through social situations, going to the store to buy groceries together, just different life experiences. When they don't have that, and then they're reading a story and you're trying to get them to get context clues about the text, they have nothing to connect it to, no background information to connect it to. Parents are disconnecting from their kids, so the kids aren't getting those real life, real world experiences. And then on top of that, not knowing how to read, the low phonics, not being able to critically think about what it is that they're reading, and then just waiting for their teacher to tell them what the text is about. So that's how you end up with adults. They just wait for talking heads to tell them what to believe, what to think. Echo chambers. They wait to be in the echo chamber to just tell them how to feel, how to think. That's how you'll end up with folks who flip-flop on every single issue because they don't actually think about them. It's not tied to any real priorities. It's just, I was told to think this, so this is what I think.
I think part of this has to do with the fact that at some point we started to emphasize critical thinking over memorization of facts. You can find this a lot in popular discussions of pedagogy. The idea is that you should teach students how to think rather than what to think. And there's some truth to that. But I think there's a crucial error that's being made there, which is that actually learning about the world and learning facts about the world goes hand in hand with learning how to think critically.
In order to critically think, you have to know facts. Like, in order to critically think about something, you have to, first of all, know what questions to ask so that you can seek out the facts to fully understand something. I guess I just have to let this play a little bit longer.
It allows you to build a mental model of the world, and you can see where new facts might fit in or where they actually contradict things that you should already know. Critical thinking and memorization might actually go hand in hand, and they help us to produce better readers.
We should have the ability to memorize different facts, but also be open to learning new facts. And that's where that critical thinking goes hand in hand. So I agree with what he's saying. It just sounded crazy when he said it at first, as if, critical thinking, you should just focus on just memorizing a bunch of things, but not critically thinking about what you're memorizing. Because let's say you memorize a bunch of data that is contradictory and doesn't make any sense. If you just memorize it and just spew what you hope it means or what you hope it represents, but you haven't critically thought about it, then you're going to be just saying a bunch of nonsense. You're just going to say a bunch of nonsense. It's not going to make any damn sense. So yeah, I agree with what he came to at the end, that yes, you should be able to not only critically think about what it is that you're taking in, but also you should have something to take in, which is the memorization aspect of it.
Call this a crisis. One researcher from Harvard University described American reading education as a very stable level of mediocrity. We've never done a great job, and things have been getting a little bit worse, but this isn't new, and it's certainly not unprecedented. And there is a lot of fear-mongering about this.
I don't think there's fear-mongering around it. I think it's as bad as we say it is. In fact, I don't think people are upset or worried about this enough. Honestly, I can't downplay it. Having worked with kids myself, even just going through my YouTube section where I will say something very clear as day in my video, but people will misconstrue it because they don't know what words mean. This is very alarming. Now, the argument of, well, this has been a problem, I'm not going to fight against that. I believe that it has been a problem because guess what? If the parents aren't able to teach the kids how to critically think, then that means the parents probably couldn't critically think for themselves. Or when it comes to reading, there are a lot of parents that will say, well, the school should be teaching my kid how to read. But it's like, well, if you know that the school is falling behind, first of all, you should be taking the reins on that. You're the first teacher of your child. So when it comes to literacy, like my dad is the one who taught me how to read. This problem, I would agree, has been a problem. I just think it's getting exponentially worse now.
If you've seen those headlines I mentioned about American literacy, there's a chance that you've seen statistics from this website. For instance, you might have heard that 21% of American adults are illiterate. But actually look at the website, and I'll put a link down below as well. There's no explanation for that number, about 21% of American adults being illiterate. No definition is also given of what they mean by illiterate. And the numbers you find on this website are painting a much worse picture than the numbers that you find elsewhere.
See, what's crazy is that he's proving the point that this is a problem. He's proving the very point that it's a problem, because the fact that people will go to the website, they're not going to look for that information to verify or fully understand what the problem is. That is exactly the problem. So even with this, while he's trying to make it seem like it's not as big of a problem, the fact that people aren't going to the website, reading it to understand, and not seeing that, oh, well, they never defined what they mean by literacy. They never defined what they never actually went into any of this. My guy, yes, the problem is as big as we're saying it is. And even with your explanation of people being fear-mongered by this data is indicative of the very problem that we're talking about. So he kind of just self-owned here. Because even with this, what you're describing is a part of the very problem that you're telling us isn't as big of a problem as we say it is. All right, y'all, if you guys want to finish this video, again, this is Jared Henderson, and this is the American Literacy Crisis Explained.